There's three things I'd like to discuss today. The analyzer. I want to show a demo of the control plane canary informational command. And then I wanted to have a sort of open discussion about pod logging, because there seems to be a lot of questions about that. And then we have not yet talked about 110. I propose also that next week we'll talk about that. Let me add that here. Can people make it next week?
Is there a
Okay.
holiday next week? You're the second person I've seen mention that.
There is no holiday for me.
Okay. It's just everyone's letting us know they're available next week then. Cool.
I think, yeah. So let's talk about the analyzer's issues. I've made a tracking issue for all of the items for istioctl analyze and the analysis status that Istio. These are the items. Many of them need owners. I was hoping to get Jason to pick someone up. If anyone wants to be an owner of one of these, talk to me. So we have a short list of analyzers to implement. I don't think that any of them are hard. If anyone wants to get started writing analyzers, I'm happy to help you along. And I don't think these are going to be too controversial. There are three that we need some consensus on. So let's take a look at those now. Howard, or John, I'm sorry, John Howard reported this one. It seems to be an analyzer bug. Does anyone want, or John, can you talk about it, and how should we prioritize this one?
Yeah, I think this is actually not an analyzer bug, but a samples bug. Like the analyzer is correctly finding an issue with the sample. Let me double check that one though.
Who owns the samples? Is that us or docs?
Technically, the docs are the code owners for it, but like this one was written by Lynn in particular.
Okay, I've added your note that this is probably a samples bug, and I've added the docs label to it. I will go through it again, knowing that. If you have any comments, though, feel free to add them. The other one is the gateway port not on workload logic. This one from Niraj. He's usually pretty reliable about these reports. So do we think he's, or I don't want to put everybody on the spot for if we think he's right or not. But this one seems like it could be important. Do we know what its priority might be?
I vaguely recall, like maybe in the PR, having some comments on this where I'm not sure if the analyzer fully works, but also Niraj's understanding was slightly incorrect. I don't remember all the details though.
So when we have a case where a TOC member who's formerly a network lead is confused, it could be a problem, because we want the logic to make sense and everything to be understandable. I want to kind of make this shared between us and networking, because and maybe even docs, it should be more clear what everything should be. One of the difficulties with writing these analyzers is I'm never sure if I should write an analyzer about a limitation, or if networking should remove the limitation, or if docs should make it clear not to do the thing that is being done.
Yeah, I
So
agree with that. I think when possible, the first check should be, is it feasible for networking to remove it? And then we should look to make an analyzer. Because I've seen a lot of times, like there were some analyzers that I was like, oh, we just spent, all this time making this analyzer. We probably could have just fixed the issue. And this, wasn't really that useful. But then there's other ones where it's like, this is just a fundamental issue with the API, or bugs that are not possible to address in, the near future, those type of things. So.
exactly. I should point out the very first one on the list for wants to implement is pretty easy if anyone wants to take it. This is the one John reported about Envoy rejecting some config. This one I could easily do myself, but I keep trying to get more people excited about writing things in this framework. So we have 3 analyzers that we are considering. There's the protocol conflicts item. This is John's again. John, should we do this one? I mean, is this one that we should analyze, or is this one that networking should fix?
I think this is one we should analyze. This is a user misconfiguration.
Okay. Let me move it up then, unless there's objections. Okay, next is the one that Steve and Dave was supposed to do, and this is the one they asked about at the workgroup leads. This pre-check analyzer to see what is sort of needed before you go ahead, other than deprecation warnings. This was supposed to check for all that gateway stuff and things that bit us last time. I have Steve and Dave here, but he's obviously not here. I asked him to unassign himself so we can know for sure that he's not going to do it. I don't want to give it to anyone else until he responds, but that is going to be important. The next one to consider is this protocol conflicts being dropped, but that's a duplicate. Let me remove that one. So we have 2 for issues on Analyze itself. There's the one to deduplicate the outputs, which I think is just a prettification thing. As John points out, it gets pretty stupid if there's huge numbers of errors that are the same. This probably needs to be sort of optional. It probably also needs to be done in istioctl and not in the istiod status writing, because in the status writing, probably every one of these should really be attached to the object. But for istioctl, it would be great if we could summarize these. The other one for Analyze itself is I don't even know how to explain. I had forgotten this one. I think I put it in this category because of John's question here. John says we should analyze all namespaces by default rather than the current default, which is just to analyze the default namespace unless you say minus all namespaces. And I think we did that not for performance, but because we kept getting hundreds of errors for these cloud vendor namespaces like IBM System. I don't have a good answer. If anyone has a thought, at one point I proposed that by default it analyze every namespace that doesn't have -system in it, but that seems silly. I don't have a good answer for how much the istioctl analyze should do by default.
I get bitten by the fact that it doesn't do all namespaces all the time. One example that shows really to me how not friendly it is when you do files. And so I pass it a blatantly wrong file, and it's like, oh, it's all good. because the file's in the foo namespace and my context is in like default or whatever. That's super confusing. Like it makes a little bit more sense in the cluster, but I still think that it would be much easier for users if we just did all the namespaces.
So let me add a comment here. Let's say it should be P1 or even P0 for 110 for files to include all namespaces used in files explicitly passed in, because that's just dumb. And then we should probably vote on what it does in the cluster. And 3, the -h docs should make it really clear if we don't do all namespaces by default, that the user should pass in all namespaces. I think that's reasonable for 110. The last one is about the status field. And I'm hoping that someone who likes working on IstioD will handle it. So istioctl does more analysis than IstioD does, which is surprising to most people. And if you look at the IstioD logs, you'll see that a lot of our analyzers are disabled in the IstioD because collections are disabled in a lot of those places. So I think Jason's got it assigned to him. He's not on the call. Probably shouldn't waste time discussing it, but we should probably decide how important it is to get parity between what IstioD does and what istioctl does. To me, it seems important to have parity. Okay, the next thing to do was give a demo of this new istioctl injector list experimental command, because on the last call, a lot of people said they hadn't seen it, and I wanted to show it to get feedback to see if it was clear enough or if we should try to make it clear. So this is an experimental command. It's merged in 1.9 as experimental. If you ask it for the injector list, it's going to tell you all of the namespaces that are injected and the things that sort of it injects. So I asked it to inject. It says, look, the default namespace is there, and it's got one pod, and it's using the default control plane. You also have an IBM system namespace with 5 non-istio pods. That's supposed to be helpful. And then, so the first report, it gets 2 reports. The first report tells you about sort of all your pods, and the second one sort of tells you about all your namespaces, saying the default namespace is injected by this injector for the default revision, and this is the sidecar image that's going to be injected. So that's not super interesting yet because we're not doing a control plane. So the next thing I'm going to do is install bookinfo, and I'm going to install it, the bookinfo, into the bookinfo namespace. So that's great. That's something a user might easily do. And when I run the command again, it tells me something kind of scary here, which is that bookinfo has non-istio pods. So I'm not sure if this is clear enough. It may be that we want to colorize this or indicate this in some way, but this info that we just injected is not in the mesh at all. It doesn't have an istio revision, and the pods are non-istio. So my first thought was, well, oh, I did that wrong. Let me label the namespace. So I label it, but I've made a subtle mistake here. We don't allow the istio rev to be default. Default is a special case. So when I do istioctl injector list, it gives me this important message missing as part of the revision. And it tells me that there's 6 non-Istio pods, and 6 of them need restarts. So that, I think I understand it. I don't understand it yet, but in my mind, I'm like, well, I better restart them. So let's just delete them and recreate them. And when I list it again, it's still unhappy. And this is when I need to realize that, well, first let me show you clearly there's only one sidecar. There's no sidecar, there's only one thing. And that is because I finally realize, and the tool doesn't help me to understand this, that this label isn't good, that the default control plane should always be handled by this kind of label. So now I have the label in as expected. When I run the new command again, it again tells me that 6 pods need restart, but it doesn't give me this missing warning. And now I see second namespace has appeared sort of correctly in the namespaces report. So it's sort of saying that the book info namespace is also injected. So let me restart the pods again. So after restarting the pods again, I'm going to list it again. One of the pods is a little slow, but the other pods, and this is the terminating one, I think. The other 6 pods they look happy. There's no errors. If I do this again, when the termination has finally happened, everything looks totally clean here. This pod is working fine. It's being injected fine. So now I'm going to install a Canary control plane. I filed a report about this today. I don't know if it's going to be accepted by environments, but it sort of says it's upgrading 110 to 1.9 and giving a bunch of warnings that only make sense if you're actually upgrading and not downgrading. Okay, when I tried this morning, it waited 5 minutes for the gateways to time out, so I'm not going to make you wait for that. Hopefully this demo will still work. Let's do the injector list now. So remember, I'm doing a control plane, but Canary, but I haven't yet had any namespaces do it. So this is unchanged, but the new control plane that I'm canarying appears here, and it's got a different sidecar image, and its namespace says does not auto-inject in capital letters, which means it hasn't yet been connected to auto-inject. So let's talk to auto-inject. And again, I made a mistake. I labeled the namespace to do this, but I didn't correctly remove the auto-inject, which goes to the default. So when I do the list, we see that it still does not auto-inject. That's weird. I added the label. Why isn't it working? Eventually, I figure out, and the tool doesn't help you to figure this out. I mean, there's an analyzer that'll tell you if you've done this, but this tool doesn't. So now I remove that sort of default plane label. And now, when I run the command, it sort of tells me that the Canary control plane is running book info, and that the book info control plane is connected to Canary, but all 6 of the pods in it need to restart. So I'm going to restart them again. And after restarting them, so these 4 that are terminating need to restart, but what it's saying now is that this is sort of correct. The book info has Istio revision, and the pods, all 6 of them, are connected to that revision. Now I'm going to uninstall the Canary control plane. Normally a person would uninstall, the original control plane, but this is showing maybe a rollback situation. And then I'm going to list the injectors again. And sort of after doing that, it's reporting that even the Canary control plane is missing from the second report, but in the first report, it's sort of saying, look, these pods are connected to a missing control plane. So what do people think of this command? Will it help understand what you're doing in the middle of a control plane canary?
Yeah, Ed, I think this moves the needle forward. Obviously there's still a lot of opportunity for error that you kind of showed in the workflow that you went through. But at least now you can get some feedback on what that error might be and some input on how to fix it, it looks like.
Hopefully it'll give you visibility on what connects to what. I'm not sure if it should, run the analyzers that are related to these problems or if it should duplicate them. But you're right, it would have been handier for it to tell you what you needed to do to move forward. But I think
I don't say that as a criticism. I think this is meaningfully better. I think that there's still room for improvement in the overall process, but that what you've shown here definitely makes the process better.
Well, thank you. I've been a little tardy uploading videos of these meetings, but I'll try to upload today's so I can get some other people to comment on this. So the next item I wanted to talk about was this request. It started out as being an issue. Someone wanted to configure access logging on a per pod basis. So we started having a long conversation in this issue. Maybe not everyone has sort of had it. One of my important guys at IBM, Ram, said, look, I want to be able to set up the access logging differently for particular pods or for the ingress and have sort of control about it. And he was upset that you could only do it for the whole mesh. So another a networking guy chimed in, well, look, you could do this with an Envoy filter, which is totally true. But this filter, which, it got 3 upvotes, so it's a great idea. But this filter turned out to be quite difficult to write. So people were trying to write it. They were screwing it up. This demo has context gateway. Another user tried to do it and couldn't get it to work. Another user was trying to change it to apply here. There just were a huge number of difficulties, and people were asking for a command. So I proposed, well, look, we could create a command, istioctl proxy config access log set format that would either create this Envoy filter or even create and apply this Envoy filter. So the idea was you would either pipe it through to kubectl create or you do it. People felt maybe this was going to be too confusing itself. I don't know. The other problem was that people were joining in. They were unable to do it. Either they screwed up their workload selector or they screwed up this context. So my second thought was maybe we need to work on some more analyzers to either check just is the workload selector satisfied by a pod, or to check is the workload satisfied by a pod that matches the context that's here. Although I'm very nervous about matching anything in the config patches because of the difficulty. The possibility also exists to try to apply the config patches ourselves, to write a tool that does a istioctl proxy config. And here, let me show how I was debugging it. So what I was doing was do the proxy config, make a capture of it beforehand, the Envoy configuration, apply the Envoy filter, capture it afterwards, and then diff them. If there is no diff, it means the Envoy filter didn't do anything to the pod that you're asking about. And I'm just wondering if anyone is either interested in this topic and wants to write these or think these are the right commands, and we can maybe make a RFC and start talking about writing them ourselves. Commands to help you understand your Envoy filter and to help you write Envoy filters.
Yeah, I have a couple comments. So first, doing an exact match in istioctl isn't possible because we need information that we don't have. It's like in the XDS node metadata. Now, for most cases, that probably doesn't matter. Like this workload selector, that's just labels, which we can do. But there's some stuff like matching a proxy version. I do think a dry run, like that takes a config dump and an Envoy filter and shows how it would change, would be pretty cool. I don't think we should have a command that adds access logging. We're going to have a telemetry API. If we want to invest efforts into adding per pod access logging, the way to go is to make that API happen instead of working around it, in my opinion.
Fair enough. I will take up this issue with the telemetry group because I think that they would be the best to handle this and see what they think of the about dozen issues raised by people as comments on this thing. John, did you say anything besides this idea of a dry run that should be recorded here before I talk about this with telemetry group?
No, not really.
Okay. I got a question from the Kiali people. We had said that we wanted to stop using the debug endpoints and use XDS, maybe even in 1.9, but we didn't do it. And that's because when 1.8 came out, we got bit really bad by some performance improvements we made in proxy status and version that about 1% of people couldn't run the new versions because they had a networking rule or some RBAC rule to prevent them from using, I forget what it was, port forward instead of exec or something. So my thought was that my old idea, which was just to get rid of the debug endpoint, is still too early for that. What I'm thinking now that we should do is have the proxy status and the version commands first try the XDS way, and then if they fail at that, to fall back to the old debug way. That means that the worst that someone could experience should be a slowdown. In the case where the control plane is located locally and you can contact XDS through a port forward, it's going to be great and work really well. When XDS is on an external control plane, currently we don't have a good way to find the XDS location. We have not scraped the injector. And John, you and I got into a discussion where I was saying networking and other groups should come up with a function I can just call to tell me, given an injector, what the XDS endpoint is. And you were saying, well, they might not even use an injector, or they might do it in an idiosyncratic way and it wouldn't always work. Do we have a thought about sort of scraping the injector and getting the XDS endpoint for users so that users don't have to mess around with figuring it out themselves when they have a lot of control planes?
I'm fine with scraping the injector as long as we have a way to like manually specify it or something.
So currently we have this XDS address option in istioctl X proxy status, and I'm proposing that we keep that. We're going to keep a default to the scraped value instead of to nothing. I think that should be sufficient. Does that address your concern, John? We would still have the ability to do these istioctl commands against an arbitrary address, but if the user didn't supply it and it was an external control plane situation, we would scrape it.
Yep, that works.
Okay, then I will update the issue to say that we're going to do that. I'd kind of like to make it a P0 for 110. Any objections if I promise to do it?
I have a question about one of the dependencies there. It's been a while since I've looked at the experimental proxy status, but I recall that recently it had a lot of TODOs in it. A lot of the data that we traditionally output was not available via XDS. Is that still the case?
So I feel like the data is all there. I feel like the to-dos we had were about other stuff that we wanted for other. So I guess first I'm just talking about proxy status and version. I feel like there were other things that we wanted to add that we didn't yet have a XDS thing for. And the other big to-do was that we didn't have a way to deal with if you have multiple instances of Istio, because you have a large mesh, you're running 2 Istio instead of 1. There's no way to talk to all of them. So that is still hanging until we can find someone who wants to implement that.
So what would the behavior be if you're contacting an Istio that is scaled up to more than one instance? What does this command do?
Well, so it's going to contact a random pod, and that means that if the odds of getting correct is 1 out of how many instances you have, which is pitiful. The other possibility would be to repeatedly make this request, hope you get different pods and coalesce them, which would be extremely slow and extremely dumb. Another possibility is something we can't do with the technique I've been talking about, but to require cloud vendors who are doing this to create a coalesced endpoint that runs in their system that's just for istioctl, not for pods. So if the cloud vendor is doing this, a microservice can be made that has access to the Istio system namespace and can just count the pods and call them exactly the way we do if the control plane is on your local cluster. And you could just expose that. And you could just say, my endpoint is, mycluster.ibm.com, and it would be great. The reason I haven't told people to do that is that way only works well if you have a way to find that new coalesced cloud vendor provided specific endpoint. If you have just one cloud vendor and just one cluster that's very large, or just one mesh, just one mesh with 20 instances, that works wonderful. But if you have, say, production and staging and testing and a bunch of different clusters, and they each have a different control plane, then you can't easily do this because there'd be no way to find that coalescing vendor provided service from the cluster, which means we have this big gap, which is why I had wanted to solve it. So we had talked about the Envoy sidecars having a way to forward into the cluster, and that's not going to happen. We talked about how maybe if one Istio catches this, that it could call its siblings. So this would be a new install time parameter that if you had more than one Istio and you wanted to support this, you would set this new variable, and it would activate a new endpoint on your IstioD that would query all the siblings and before returning results. I think people hated that because it adds a new function to IstioD and that it could have performance implications. Like if a lot of people are accessing this endpoint and these siblings are all trying to talk to each other. But I don't know of any good way to solve it other than that.
So I know that in 1.8 we had asked the networking working group to come up with an API that included federated XDS so that we could support proxy status on external control plane. I
We
don't
did.
know the status of that work.
I know the status. They didn't do it.
Okay. So I think that's really a prerequisite to this. As important as this command is, I would much rather not be able to support external control planes than support them with data that is not accurate.
Fair enough. So do you have a sense of how, so first, the data is only inaccurate if there's more than one control plane. My feeling is that for a lot of cloud vendors, they're going to have one IstioD pod per mesh, and they're not going to scale up IstioD. But you're right. If they do scale up IstioD, it's terrible. Furthermore, all the stuff I've been talking about is just hacks we could do without network's permission. We really would like a clean solution supported by the people who maintain IstioD to give you this federated view of XDS events. However, there's no one on the networking team who wants to provide that because the pods themselves don't need it. They're happy just talking to one endpoint. It's only troubleshooting that needs it. So in that sense, it's sort of our responsibility to implement, but none of us here want to implement something in IstioD that could have performance characteristics and problems that we wouldn't know maybe enough about the internals to fix. I mean, I could make an inefficient implementation pretty easily, but could I make an efficient one?
So it sounds like with external control planes, the other working groups have introduced a topology that is not compatible with our troubleshooting tools. We're going to need to lean on them for an implementation because Ed, I agree, like, especially after our experience with status, the odds of us being able to work successfully in the IstioD code base are very minimal.
So we tried leaning hard on them in 1617 timeframe. Leaning hard did not work. This may be something that we need to raise to the TOC to find out whose responsibility it is. It's a shared responsibility, and I'd be happy to co-write it with someone from networking, but I can't just lean on them and get them to do it.
Right. Yeah, we do need TOC support on that. I mean, I think the way that we explain this is pretty simple. There's not going to be support for our existing debug tools in external IstioD until we have an API we can use.
So
And our efforts at designing an API have been met with a lot of resistance. So we need someone else to come along and design an API or propose different tools. Maybe proxy status is just the wrong command to be running against external control planes.
Right. So proxy status has two pieces. One piece is to list all of the proxies and whether they're in sync or not. And that's the one that definitely needs to talk to all the control planes. The other one is to find this, compare the status that Pilot has versus the status that Envoy has, which only needs to talk to a particular one. It may be that we need to sort of deprecate those. Some people say, well, with the last 2 or 3 versions of Istio, the proxies really aren't getting stale. And maybe we should stop even telling people to run this command. Or maybe this command is only for cloud admins, and we should not expect it to talk to external control plane because the people who are running it are the cloud admins who are running it sort of themselves on where they're in charge of the control plane cluster. So we could just abandon many uses of proxy status. That might be better than trying to get all these pilots to talk to their siblings.
Yeah, I personally think that it serves kind of three purposes. One is the diff. I think that's not particularly useful because you're much more likely to find a bug in the diffing logic because it's very version sensitive than Istio to actually have a legitimate difference in the config it sent to Envoy. That would be kind of an obscure bug. The other one is whether stuff is synced or not. I think the assumption is it is synced unless we know otherwise. So I would rather see a tool that just indicates the exceptional case that it's not synced, which we already report through metrics and other ways. And if we really needed to, from like external Istio, we could write it to like a config map or something, because it's rare, right? It's an exception, not the norm, and it's not moving at high velocity. And then the third case is just what is connected. That I don't have an easy solution for.
So you pointing out that we already send a message to telemetry when something goes out of sync is key. Do you think we should just rewrite istioctl to talk to Prometheus for the information instead of istiod?
I think it's kind of tricky because users may not have Prometheus because it's optional, and also like for example on the Google external control plane, we'll probably use Stackdriver, not Prometheus. Users may not have Prometheus.
I don't always have Prometheus. Do you think we could convince networking to write this in addition to Prometheus into some other Kubernetes thing, be it a config map or an event or something, that we would use?
Well, if we do merge the status stuff, it's basically answering the same question in a different way, right?
Right.
But that seems to be running into the same problem this API is. The criticism is that it requires coordination between instances of istiod, right? As I understood, John, that was you and Costin's primary objection.
I don't know. There's different objections as well. I don't know if that one is blocking at this point.
And remember, the reason I'm coming up with this is because Kiali was asking me about what we're doing for 110. So I don't really know what Kiali's sort of dependency is on proxy status. But if they are using it for something, they might object to us putting it in a config map or Prometheus and dumping whatever debug endpoint we're using now. So hopefully maybe I can join the next Kiali playback and ask them.
The difficulty with dumping it into a config map is in an external istiod, the operators of the pods don't have access to config maps, right? Because istiod is running in a different cluster.
That's true. But if we put it in a config map, we could have Pilot monitor those config maps and keep them around the same way it keeps everything else around, cached, and then the output of debug or whatever could just be to output those caches.
So it would write config maps into its own cluster and then read from those config maps whenever an XDS proxy status request comes in.
No, I think it should watch from those same config maps it's writing.
Sure. But the bottom line, the data flow would be between istiods and then to the client through XDS.
Well, we've already got it. Whether it's through XDS or we rewrite the debug endpoint to output these clusters. Just the idea is that the command shouldn't just go through internal data structures that are used to generate XDS, but they should go through this thing that is produced by all of the sibling istiods.
It could also be that istioctl is the one that reads the config map, right?
But
or we, instead of doing config maps, we write in a, if we, we don't need to say that something is synced. We only need to say that it's not synced if it's not synced, right? The assumption is it's synced otherwise. And so we could just, when there's an event that makes it out of sync, we could just write an event, like we've had the eventing proposal,
right?
Pod or config map. I mean, I don't really care where it goes. The point is that it's persisted and not shared between istiods in like some stateful manner.
The reason we want this is for external. So I know the external control plane can read my cluster. Can the external control plane write events or config maps to my cluster?
I mean, it can do whatever you give it permission to do. So
Yeah, we should be able to do that. Sorry, I was thinking it was writing the config map into its own cluster, which of course would not be viable.
So I was thinking its own cluster if it's going to use that to enhance its own debug or XDS endpoint. But the alternative is to write it into the cluster of the pod that it's talking to.
yeah, like the Kubernetes way to do this, which is done by managed external control planes in some clouds, is like something goes wrong, you write an event or status to the object that has the issue, right?
Yep.
So we could write an event on the pod that says this pod is stale, and or we could have a status on the resource itself and say this one was not distributed, or maybe both. Yeah, like we could be both. They answer slightly different questions. One is, has this pod gotten all the info? And the other one, has this resource made it to all pods? Which I think both are useful in different scenarios.
Yeah, that seems valid. I don't think we can write to status on pods because that's controlled. That's owned by the pod controller.
Yeah, I agree. I think we would do events, and then events aren't persisted forever. They go away. But I think we would continue to not update it, and so we would continually write the event that it's not updated. I mean, this is off the top of my head. I haven't tried this or played around with it, but
when you say not updated, you mean a knack, effectively?
Yeah, like a knack. Yeah, I think that's the only case of the not update is a knack, basically, or an extremely delayed ACK, I suppose. We don't really measure that, but we could.
Okay, well, this is food for thought. So next week we're going to talk about the 110 roadmap. I'll make an issue for this and we can discuss that as we're talking about the roadmap. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Anything else before I close the meeting? Thanks, guys. I had a great discussion with you all. I wish we could have had more people here for this one because I think we had some good technical stuff.
Thanks, Ed.
See you next week. Bye.